Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guests from around the world. Welcome, Mark Anderson.
Hello there. How's it going?
No worries, we're going really well. How are you going, Mark?
Mighty fine. A little hot here in Texas, South Texas, and there's lots of border issues too, very close by.
I
If
bet.
you've heard of Donna, Texas, if you've never heard of Donna, Texas, you've probably heard of it now because that's where the big detention center is, only a half mile from my house where I'm sitting.
Okay.
It's made worldwide news. So big border breach going on.
Okay, right. So that's certainly affecting you there. That's right. And Robert Klinck, welcome, Robert.
Hi, Arnie. Yes, Mark, we have a detention issue in Canada too, but it's for Canadian citizens who are not
Mm,
meeting all the requirements of the COVID dictatorship.
my
Okay,
goodness.
no worries. Thank you, Robert. And Wallace Klinck, welcome, Wallace.
Well, we are approaching or attempting to deal with another very threatening institution, I guess you would call it, a Christian church. They apparently have put a fence around it, and the pastor has been, of course, charged and may possibly have to spend some considerable time incarcerated until his case is heard by the courts. So this sounds like the Soviet Union.
It certainly does.
I heard today that it was a triple fence now wall.
A triple
A
fence.
trip,
They're sparing no expense to shut this church down.
yeah,
And they've got, dozens of police officers out there 24 hours a day. It's incredible.
Stasi.
There's no limit to what they will do to prevent anybody from having an independent activity that doesn't kowtow to the COVID regulations.
No, and now we're beginning to learn that because we find that the more there is opposition to it, the more extreme measures they will definitely go to in order to suppress any
Yeah.
objection to the strictures that have been put on society
Yeah,
on account of this alleged virus.
yeah, yeah. So they're certainly playing the panic card well in order to impose what you're saying correctly is martial law. All right.
Well, you have to ask the question: if they will actually do something like this,
Yeah,
what will they do?
yeah, yeah.
What won't they do?
In the end,
And what won't they do? Yeah.
what won't they do? That's exactly right. What do you expect from them when they have this totalitarian mindset? Okay, I'm going to do a lap of our newspapers in Australia, and just give you some idea of what is going on. Um, it's interesting here with the Peter Dutton talking to the diggers. Now, the diggers, of course, Australian soldiers, and he's saying we've got your backs, but in actual fact, that's a load of crap, because what he's actually happening is we've got elite servicemen who are being um, under duress through the courts for acts in a theatre of war. Elite servicemen doing their duty and obeying orders, and here they are, and he's saying we've got your back. So this is, to me, is typical conservative crap that comes out their mouth. That you've got to look at what they're actually doing, not what they say, and they're not covering the backs of our servicemen at all. They're really are. They're undermining all their institutions, and of course, this just goes on to reinforce this. I'm furious at it because I was a serviceman and I know how important and how vulnerable you are to the government to do the right thing. And here it is that we've got a highly decorated soldier going through the courts, and they're doing video evidence from around the world. They're not even bringing the supposed witnesses to the trial. So it's all a kangaroo court, as you say, Wally. This is Stasi stuff. Okay, so AstraZeneca, it's having serious issues about blood clots. Confidence is dropping in Australia. We've even had some of the people who are maintaining security around the isolation centres are refusing to take the vaccine. I know a lot of young mums young ladies are refusing to take the vaccine. They seem to have been doing their research outside of the mainstream media, and I think that's very, very important, that they actually hold healthy skepticism towards our government, because I don't believe our government deserve it. Epoch Times, I'll say the same each week about Epoch Times. They go into a dialectical argument. Trump and the Republicans, Biden and the Democrats, they offer no search for truth. It really is just that Trump is in exile, in a sense, from the presidency, and he is our president, and we've got to endorse him. And I'm thinking, you've got to think further than that. You've got to actually do a lot more of your own thinking about what it is in society that brings you together, causes you to actually form laws, form constitutions, associations, and all that. And are we actually getting what we want out of it? Are we actually achieving the increment in association as a consequence of our laws, of our social credit, of our constitution? Gateway Pundit, yeah, just bringing issues up. I wanted to actually touch on something here in our website. This is the Social Credit Library. It's reasonably comprehensive, and under Jeremy Lee, under Lee here, you'll see Australia 2000, What Will We Tell Our Children, Impact Voting, but I think also Upon That Mountain is a very important book, because in these books Jeremy has actually dealt with, I knew Jeremy, I met him, he actually wrote me my commission, and in these books he talks about special drawing rights, about setting up a World Bank and having special drawing rights for these ancillary banks to actually draw credits from a central bank. So it's a method of controlling national banks, national currencies, national economies. And just to talk about this idea of internationalism, of actually having complete control over a nation through administration, Eric Butler in '93 laid the groundwork to this thought when he produced this video, The Fabian Idea Throughout History. You'll find it on our BitChute channel. I've only just put it up. Jeremy talks about the legalised theft of Australia's money system with the emasculation of our Commonwealth Bank. These are very important, because in order to have a world economy, in order to have a world government, you've got to have a world financial system. And that's really, really important that you consider that. A world financial system is actually a necessary part of world government. And so what we're seeing today is we're seeing the, if you like, the surfacing in discussion of special drawing rights. And I will make a claim here, because I've done a search on the American Federal Reserve Act, amongst other documents, for special drawing rights. And in my view, I'm not an expert, but in my view, 2018, the American Federal Reserve Act was updated, and it included this ability for special drawing rights. I'd be keenly interested on your view on this, Mark Anderson.
Yes, we're getting a bunch of background noise. I don't know where that's coming from. Anyway, yes, Janet Yellen, the current U.S. Treasury Secretary, spoke to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs April 5th. And she is, of course, a recent Federal Reserve chairman. That was under Barack Obama. She's the only former head of the economic advisors and former Federal Reserve chairman to become a Secretary of the Treasury. So we have a central banker as our Treasury Secretary. And she noted in the post-World War II era, maybe those who were neglected by globalism, didn't get many benefits, she admitted. Coming out of World War II, globalism began to grow up, and there were those that were left behind. And then she goes on to say, America first must never mean America alone, as if it ever did. This is more of this flim-flam that these banksters often get into. Nobody ever said that America first would mean America alone. It's a completely false argument. No one ever said it, and yet she argues against it. It's a typical verbal tactic that these banksters use. And she said that the last 4 years, and she's referring to the Trump years, have taught us the futility of the isolationist stance that Janet Yellen implied helped bring on World War II to begin with. Another falsehood, that national isolationism, to the extent that it even really existed in the 1920s and 1930s, that was the major factor in bringing about World War II. That is categorically false. And she goes on to say that President Biden, well, some say the alleged president or resident or the pretender in chief, I call him, President Biden, his $1.9 trillion pandemic package is the largest of its kind, said Janet Yellen, since the Great Depression, with 100 million vaccines, 100 million jabs, as they call them, in just 58 days in the United States. And she was talking about all this, guys, as the spring meeting of the International Monetary Fund happens in D.C. I covered that once in person in 2011. Let me tell you, that was an experience. When you go in the IMF World Bank facilities, I'll make a quick footnote. There's a display of all the currencies around the world, and the currencies look like they're behind bars. They look like they're jailed. It's like they look imprisoned. It's an unmistakable metaphor of the way they display the currencies around the world, as if they've been locked up or incarcerated. Maybe that's just my interpretation, but that's the way it looked. But anyway, Janet Yellen announced that with the G20 coming up, there's going to be a lot of special drawing rights as the IMF meets this spring in DC, which is just in a week or two, or it may be happening very quickly. It's this month anyway, April of 2021. So she said, so the poorest countries are looking at 650 billion of special drawing rights for greater spending on vaccinations and healthcare. COVID-19 has clearly shown that threats like COVID require global cooperation. So you get the picture. They're going to pump a lot of special drawing rights in the direction of so-called poorer countries. And they say that one of the things these poor countries lack, one of the things that in fact makes them poor, is they're not getting the vaccines nearly as fast as the so-called wealthier nations. So they talk about vaccine nationalism at the Chicago Global Affairs Council by Janet Yellen and in other One World internationalist groups. And they have this argument that, well, if you're a nation and your citizens are getting the vaccine quickly and efficiently, well, you're being selfish and one-sided. You're not being internationalist enough. You're not helping see to it that the poorer nations get their vaccines just as quickly as the richer nations. So it looks to me like these special drawing rights will help bridge the gap. That's the way Janet Yellen was peddling this April 5th to the Chicago Global Affairs Council, as noted. And just as a capstone on all this, and you hear this all the time through these so-called capitalist internationalists, that with the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, they're pursuing green investments and infrastructure toward a net zero economy, net zero carbon emissions, that is. And then all of this must be festooned with inclusiveness and tackling inequality and protecting LGBTQ populations and all these arbitrarily created and identified minority groups and that are peddled by the media and these internationalist groups nonstop. So you've got Biden's pandemic money, the 1.9 trillion. You've got the 650 billion in special drawing rights that extends the vaccines internationally. Biden's money is mostly for the U.S. And then you've got the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and the World Bank meeting this month. And so the G20 might be a little later, but the World Bank Group is meeting this month. So all these things are converging, and COVID is the common denominator, along with climate change to a degree, and inclusiveness and equity and all these things. But COVID is now being hardwired into the international monetary system. And in fact, I got a note today from one of my American Free Press editors that world leaders are calling for a global treaty now, 24 world leaders in the wake of the pandemic. And so they would build a treaty around the coronavirus outbreak as an opportunity to consign nationalism to the dustbin of history, according to G. Edward Griffin's website, which is Need to Know News. So that's a snapshot of what's going on in my neck of the woods, what I've been looking at, and then what's going on in the U.S. and around the world.
Thank you so much for that, Mark.
Thank you so much for that, Mark.
That's brilliant.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
I'm going to cut back to the websites and just highlight that when you consider this Fabian idea that Eric brought up in 93, 27 years ago, what he was saying in that video, and it really is important and it's current for our discussion today, is that the idea of having a world administration or of having a group of elite, supposedly brilliant people making all the decisions that really count for the republic of the world, goes back before even Plato. But Plato wrote about it in a book titled just that, The Republic. And Eric highlights this idea of complete control outside of the individual by some elite group. You can see the actual design, intent or purpose behind it within the Illuminati pursuit of the French Revolution, and of course the ongoing Illuminati, if you like, in Marxism. Marx, of course, was a highly educated man, sponsored by the millionaire Lenin, and of course the you've got to consider Marx and Engels. It was Engels who was the sponsor, and you've got to consider that these are not stupid people. These are very, very intelligent people who are attempting to bring about world government. And on the basis of that, you say, okay, Marx and Engels, the Russian Revolution, we saw that. But nowadays, how do we see the outworking of it? We see it in our politicians and our industrial leaders through an organisation you might call the Fabians, the Fabian Society. And of course, in, I think it was 90s, Bob Hawke, our Prime Minister at the time, 86 it was, I think 83 or 86, Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister, he actually addressed the Fabian Society, a 100-year celebration of the Fabian Society, and he, of course, being a Fabian. But the point that Eric makes in this, apart from reading the speech that Bob Hawke spoke, we've got it on our website, Eric shows you that Fabianism was inherent within conservatism. It was inherent within what we call the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the National Party. All these leaders were bringing about world government. They were bringing about this same, if you like, Illuminati policy, the same perspective. And so you've really got to consider that in your considerations of the history, of the evolution of these ideas. Now, Wally, how are you going there? No? You ready for the floor? Okay, I'm going to bring you on the floor. Wally Klinck.
Well, I think if you go back and analyze it to its elements, there's an assumption here that human beings, a creation of nature, of God, are simply not capable of living freely amongst themselves in a constructive manner, and they need the guidance of an intelligentsia, a self-proclaimed group of people who literally, I think it is fair to say, have attempted to appropriate the position of a deity, of a natural order, of natural law, and they are going to organize and manipulate society, humanity, into prescribed forms of activity and behavior, which they are claiming to have the secret of success. But it shows you a very drastic difference of policy and philosophy, of course, from which the policy comes, with regard to humans. Humans are obviously regarded as lesser creations which are not capable of living according to natural law in a successful manner, and need the guidance of the cognoscenti, the knowing ones, those who apparently, or at least profess to have superior knowledge, and knowledge which justifies them manipulating, controlling, and channeling human affairs and activities according to the highly ideological motivation that lies behind this. In other words, you can pretty well eliminate any notion of genuine freedom, because freedom is circumscribed by the notion that certain other people or certain people have the ability and the right, apparently, to run civilization, to control humanity and the activities in which humans engage. Now, that certainly strikes a social creditor as being an incredible arrogance. I mean, by what right do they make such claims? From where do they derive the authorization, the authority, in the nature of things, to control their fellow men? They don't control ordinary people as their fellow men. They regard them as inferior beings who are fit only to be literally enslaved.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for that, Wally. That's exactly right. Self-proclaimed elite who choose to dominate over all others, and of course that is a counter philosophy to the words of Christ when he says, "The kingdom of God is within." The kingdom is within. And that to me is the most beautiful part of the Christian message, is that freedom, this life, comes from God, not from man. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck. Hang on a sec, Robert. I've lost your noise. Just hang on a sec. Okay, start again. Sorry.
Yes, the drive to consolidate power, transcending national borders, goes back a long way now. You know, in the French Revolution that started in 1789, they came up with what they thought were universal ideals that should be applied throughout the world, at least, I guess, the European world they were thinking of then. And along came Napoleon, who conquered half of Europe, tried to conquer Russia as well and failed, but he installed his brothers in the courts of Spain and Italy and Sardinia. His whole family was ruling Europe essentially because of his military exploits. And then, so this was an attempt to install a political uniformity over the continent of Europe. Then there was the war against Napoleon. And the result of that, you would have thought, would be that the nations would have gone back to their concept of sovereignty. But following the defeat of Napoleon, there was the Treaty of Vienna. And the big idea of the Treaty of Vienna was to further political consolidation of the continent of Europe. It didn't get very far, but this is an ideal that has been pursued throughout history and largely through the efforts of financiers who were the engine behind the idea. And it's very strange that you get to the 20th century, you have the phenomenon of Hitler. Well, the argument was that Hitler was trying to conquer all of Europe, and he did a pretty good job of extending German influence over it. And so there was an effort to undo his military accomplishments. And the result of that was that the whole of Eastern Europe fell to communism. So the consolidation went on, and there didn't seem to be any great opposition to it falling under the aegis of communism. And then, of course, you had the European Economic Community come along. That community was supposed to be economically based, and then gradually over time they have consolidated it into European Union. The European Union has abolished the borders of the former countries. So now all the cultures of Europe that took centuries upon centuries to evolve and were what actually made the place interesting have been diluted. and the cultures are disappearing from the face of the earth. I think it's a bit like roses and daffodils and peonies, but they're trying to make everything into just one form of flower. It's a tragedy, but this pressure has been applied to politics now for over 2 centuries, for sure, probably more than that. I think that the Illuminati had that same idea of abolishing national borders, same thing, as did the Marxists in the 19th century. So it's an idea that's been pursued all this time, and it's being promoted through the power of finance. And they have got now to a point. For the earlier period, they didn't have the technology that would allow them to accomplish this consolidation of international power in a way that could be enduring. But now, with the technology of computers and artificial intelligence and algorithms and all this stuff, they have the tools whereby they can actually destroy nations and bring the populations of those nations to subservience and keep them there. And this obviously is the goal at the present time. You can see it everywhere, and the COVID crisis has come along very conveniently to give them the excuse to finalize this consolidation of international power and establish a global government. That is clearly, to me, the aim of what is going on here, as well as the climate problems and the carbon dioxide problems that they insist are going to bring the world to an end in a decade or something like that. It's all crisis after crisis, artificial crisis after artificial crisis, designed to allow nations to be subordinated to this global administration, global government.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's a very valid and lucidly put point. I want to, just before I get back to you, Mark, I just want to cut across to our PDF library and make reference to a new booklet that I've just put in there under the name of Jenck, H-E-A-F-G-H-I-J, where is it? Jenck's, there it is, Jenck's History of Politics. It's a small booklet, 180 pages, I think, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant because in his writing, Jenck's points out the history of the witch doctors, amongst others, even the ancient tribes. And I say ancient in the sense that they were pre-agricultural communities. Pre-agricultural, so they were ancient communities. And in particular in Africa and also in Australia. And these pre-agricultural communities had witch doctors. And the witch doctor would hold power over the people through his declaration that he was actually capable of bringing the rain, and of course he had no control over it whatsoever, but that's what he declared, and the people were held in subservience based on this belief that he had control of something, some natural phenomena, which of course understanding it didn't take much to realize that it was a ruse, but very important because it's a method of control, and it's not foreign to what we're actually witnessing today. This COVID lockdown, the climate threat, the sunspots, the ozone layer, the Y2K, all the war against terrorism, all these things are essentially controlled by our witch doctors to cause us into subservience and to fear, when in actual fact what we've got to do, seriously, is to stop believing. Stop believing in the rubbish that they send us. Your thoughts, please, Mark Anderson. Okay, it looks like Mark has dropped out, which is unfortunate. I'll just come back to that. Wally Klinck, how are you feeling?
Well, I'm still awake.
Okay, let's keep going, because Wally's been a bit rattled, so we're happy to have you on, Wally, and hope you can work your way through.
It all boils down to the fact that some people seem to have, what would you say, a natural ability to read other people, to predict other people's behavior if they are subject to certain stimuli.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some people who seem to want to effect this control over other people for the power that they, it's almost like a drug. You get a high from this power and being able to control other people against their will and in accordance with your will. And this has been a problem throughout history. It's the science of power. And we talk about the witch doctor. Eric Butler used to speak of the economists as being the witch doctors. It sounds rather primitive, but it's not. It is actually a very, very valid concept because it means that you're able to control other people's thought processes and consequently behavior in a way that is induced by you instead of something that just happens within the nature of things, the nature of natural law as it evolves concerning the creations of the universe. We have this. It's a psychopathic megalomaniac desire to control other people. And control of other people, control as such, is not the important thing about human association. The important thing about human association is that you do the right thing. And we have to determine whether the right thing is incarnate within the individual or whether it is something held by people of superior knowledge, intellectual power, intellect. And either there is natural law or there is not. If there's natural law, we will function according to what we are as created beings. And if there's any rationale to our creation, we will function in a constructive and beneficial manner. But there seems to be a very, very strong effort being made to convince society that virtually everything is a threat. We're not in a universe or in a creation which is designed to support us, although we have emerged and we have prevailed. These people seem to be convinced or wanting to convince others that only their superior guidance can save humanity, and humanity is being perpetually threatened by all sorts of hostile and alien forces. Now, this would seem to run counter to the nature of a rational universe. We should be able to look forward to getting a better life. Yeah, a varied life, yes, but a life that is rich and that is healthy, that is teeming with life. See, the thing that is being advanced today is that we're in a hostile environment, and that only extreme measures to control living human beings can hold any hope whatever of saving us from our perpetual enemies. It is a very, very dismal concept of life. Very, very dismal indeed. It's important that we do things the right way, not that we do things according to some dictated manner, which certain people claim to be in their particular hands. So, I mean, I think we are really traveling in a direction of a very dangerous direction, a direction which, if there is going to be uniformity, if there's going to be cooperation, if there's going to be any kind of meaningful association amongst people, is going to be destroyed because there are other people who say that they know what should be done, and not only do they know what should be done, but they will ensure that everyone else does what they are sure they know. And I couldn't think of a more dangerous, more arrogant conception of life. Dennis Byrne wrote an interesting essay not too long before his passing, and he pointed out that everyone has a personal relationship with the deity, with God, and that anyone who attempts to interfere with that, against that person's will, commits sacrilege, because they are going against the nature of beings which are created supposedly in the image of the Creator, of God. And that is a very, very dangerous position to take, because you're taking a position that runs counter to the natural law of the universe. But then, of course, the Marxist, as you know, does not believe in natural law. The Marxist believes in human law, a law that is imposed by the superior intellects which populate, allegedly, this globe. And so you see, it's a very different conception. One necessarily contains the notion of genuine freedom for the individual. The other one contains the notion of freedom only for those who profess to have superior knowledge which qualifies them to direct everyone else. And, it's something that is reinforced by crises. And so that crises, as Arnie was saying, are rampant, and they are created crises. They are crises that are created by the prevailing media, which serves the financial system. By the way, the French Revolution was financed by banking interests in Switzerland. And so that the revolution has been a child of finance from probably the very beginning. It's a way of using an abstraction, because money is an abstraction, being something that purports to reflect reality. It is therefore an abstract force or influence, and it has exercised its influence over humanity throughout the ages. So you have an abstraction that is controlling us, and this, of course, is to do with the idea of propaganda, of convincing through psychological means society of certain things which are not necessarily true at all. It may be a complete delusion.
Yeah.
And insofar as it's used for the purpose of centralizing power by a few, it is an unnatural thing, a delusionary thing, and a thing which can therefore bring only disaster upon mankind, because we're divorcing ourselves from the, as I said before, the natural law, the law which actually, under which we were created and which would normally govern our activities. So we're being completely deluded by a very powerful and prevalent system of propaganda that is carried on by the media. And the media, as we know or should know, is a child and an agency of the financial system. In other words, the media serves finance.
That's it. Exactly right. Thank you, Wally, for that. That's I understand you're pushing hard, and I really appreciate your input. Mark Anderson,
Absolutely.
you're back, and I'd like to give you the floor. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah.
You can't hear us?
Oh man.
Speak, Mark, because we can hear you. No, you can't hear us? Okay, I'll come back. All right, Robert Klinck, I'll give you the floor. Thank you so much for being patient. Sorry, you've got
delusion. Pardon?
You've got the sound back on. I had you silenced because there's a lot of background noise. Start again, please, Robert.
Oh, okay. Well, Wally was saying that we have an effort possibly to make our thinking operate on the basis of delusions. And I really think we've got to the point where our thinking is basically functioning on the basis of delusions. There's been a great effort to instill these in our minds for decades now. And the thing is that they try to get contradictory ideas instilled into us so that our ability to reason is impaired. And this is done through the mechanism of cognitive dissonance. That's a very important term. And since I became aware of this phenomenon, I have applied my analytical powers to television. I don't watch much television, but to news reports, to articles, to newspaper articles. And if you do this, you can see that practically everyone has this cognitive dissonance embedded in it. It cannot be accidental. I mean, it sounds like a nearly incredible conspiracy, but it is actually going on. Now, it could well be that it's the result of cognitive dissonance that has been instilled in the minds of the people producing this supposed information material. But it is really something that astonishes you once you get clued into it and you become sensitive to how it is being used against us. You know, there are government agencies that are specializing in this psychological manipulation. In the UK, there's an organization called 77 Brigade. I think it's part of the military. And their whole function is to distort the debate that goes on in the internet world. So they're trying to create all sorts of consensus among the population based on false information that is being inseminated by people who have an intent to confuse. There was this fellow in the United States, his name, I believe, was Cass Sunstein, and he had for a time, he was the administrator of the Office of Information for the American government. And his doctoral thesis, as I understand it, was how to create and use myths to influence public opinion. So this kind of activity is going on all the time, and there are specialists in it who are highly trained. They know all the triggers that they can apply to the human prejudices, and they can control our thinking by their interventions in the information we're getting. It's actually a sort of conspiracy by public functionaries against the populations. Now, it's not a surprise that this exists because the people who are in power want to retain that power, and they will do what is necessary in their eyes to do so. And if they can accomplish this by having the whole world think in terms of delusions or mythologies that aren't factual, then they will resort to this, and they are in very serious ways. So there are all kinds of myths. There's myths of scarcity, economic scarcity. You have to be blind not to see that we're actually living in a world of economic plenty, but they can actually persuade people that they ought to be tightening their belts and that they should accept that they are not enjoying the fruits of the enormous productive capacity that we've evolved. And so this is a primary myth that is used to control us, because, of course, if we had a sense of the potential for a good life that lies in our advanced technology, then we would become restive, I would think, against these controls and strictures that governments are constantly saying must be imposed upon us. And we've now got to a point where these controls are absolutely outlandish, telling us we have to stay in our houses, telling us that we can't show our smiles to our neighbors, telling us that we can't talk to our neighbors, telling us we can't get close to another human being. You can see how the control goes from step to step, always becoming more extreme, until they get some kind of absolute shackling of the population, so that they are no longer capable of asserting their belief in their own freedom and their belief in their right, their entitlement to participate in the fruits of economic plenty and abundance.
Yeah, exactly right, Robert. The greatest myth ever perpetuated on mankind is the existing money system, because here we are in Adelaide, and I'll give you an illustration. To me, it's a perfect illustration. You've got the Adelaide people, approximately 1 million, bit over, say, 1.5 million across the state. To the north of us is significant reserves of iron ore, absolutely huge reserves. And also amongst those reserves is coal. And we've happened to have some very good ports in the area, so we've got access to transport. And on the basis of those reserves, we've got a struggling steel industry. Struggling because, of course, the debt merchants tell us that we can't actually have our own steel manufacturer. Now, this is absurd. We've got the iron ore. We've got the infrastructure. We actually have a steel industry there. We used to have a shipbuilding yard there. We had a power generation plant there until the previous government dynamited it. Act of vandalism against the very infrastructure. This is the threat that is being imposed on us as a people. That our governments, our administration is actively acting violently against our freedoms, against our security, against our well-being. We could have the steel industry. We could be making our own steel ingots in this very area. We could, historically, 45 years ago, we had shipbuilding there. And a Conservative government, just in the stroke of a pen, shut down that shipbuilding yard. They had no right to do that, because it was actually the security, part of the security of Australia's borders, is that we are an island nation and we have to have shipping. We've got to have shipping for transport, for economics, but also for defence. And here it is, we can't even produce our own steel. Conservative government actively campaigning against the better interests of its own people. You've got to consider this. You've really got to look at it. And of course, that's why Eric's video is so important, because he highlights that this thread of tyranny, this thread of totalitarianism, this thread of treachery against the people goes back thousands of years, that there are individuals in society who would actually undermine, destroy, or campaign to actually destroy the culture, the civilization. And in this case, of course, in South Australia, our own well-being, our own security. They want to emasculate us. They are working for a power outside of our own people, and we've got to seriously consider that. Your thoughts, please, Wally, and I'll actually call for closing comments. Okay, it looks like I've lost Wally as well. So I'm going to come back and just call for closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, I think you hit on something there with that term emasculation, Arnie, because the populations of the so-called Western democracies, I guess, anyway, the countries that had traditions of parliaments and congresses that supposedly represented the will of the people is passé now. It's been totally undermined, and so the population has no way of effecting bringing its will to bear on the activities of its government. This is an undermining of the whole concept of the constitutional concept of our societies that has been effected. It's sort of a pulling of the rug out from under the populations. And they're responsible. I mean, we're to blame because we've been asleep. And if we don't wake up soon, we're going to be in big trouble. But definitely everywhere you see that parliaments are acting without reference to the will of their constituents, and parliaments, in effect, don't seem to be acting in accordance with the will of the parliamentarians. There's some other esoteric influence that is controlling policy now. And it's obviously coming from an international source, because you can see that it is uniform from one country to another. It's not a homegrown phenomenon. It's something that's being imposed internationally. And all the problems that society is allegedly facing now have this international character, whether it be climatic or health. Everything involves the suppression of sovereignty of the nations who are allegedly dealing with these problems. And that goes along with this movement toward technocracy, which is ruled by experts. In this COVID crisis, we're constantly told, listen to the scientists, trust the science. Well, the science is hardly uniform, hardly consistent, because there are all sorts of people who are dissenting. There's that great Barrington Declaration. It has something like, I think, 60,000 medical professionals who have said that the approach that's been taken to dealing with this supposed COVID crisis is going to be more destructive than anything that the virus itself could ever have done. I mean, 60,000. You don't hear about this in the news, because the news is the property of these international financiers, and they can suppress and discredit anybody they want. And they can also make trouble for any politician who doesn't go along with their program. And this is why this astonishing uniformity of all these politicians just falling into like click, 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 click. No dissenters. They're all following exactly the same program. It's as though there's no independence of thought anymore in the political world. They're just agents of a propaganda campaign.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. I'm just going to actually just leave you up there just for a sec while I just bring up another website, because it is important for us to consider the ramifications of what you're actually saying. Now let's see, have I lost it or have I not? I think I've not. I'm just going to send that. There it is there. Okay, I'm going to cut across and just talk about something, because I think it's quite important to look at these things. In this instance, we've got an election in Tasmania, and what's happening is there happens to be a bloke who's reasonably popular, and he happens to be a Labor politician. But the party is actually freezing him out. They are attempting to throw him out of the situation. They are attempting to discredit him and to remove him from actually being effective and running in this election. I am of the view that the party itself is deliberately planning to lose the election. This is where the reverse of what happened in Western Australia. In Western Australia, the Conservative Party deliberately planned, in my view, to lose the election. And what's also going on within the Conservative Party is they're weeding out any actual Conservatives. If you're not left-wing, if you're not small L liberal, if you're not woke, then of course you're being thrown out of the party. So it really is a fight to the death of what's actually going on within the Conservatives. Now the reverse of this is happening in Tasmania, and that is that anyone who is Conservative, who traditional Labor might be, within the Labor Party, they're actually being weeded out, they're being thrown out, and the Labor Party, the supposed opposite party to the Conservatives, is deliberately laying down and showing, if you like, disarray, confusion, and they want the existing government to stay in power. They want it because the existing government is being endorsed. And this is where the cognitive dissonance comes into it, because we think, well, they're the opposition. Why would they be destroying themselves? Surely they would actually present an alternative voice. No intention of doing that whatsoever. What they're doing is the public is going to look at them and say, well, look at them, they're in disarray, there's no way I can endorse them, therefore I've got to stay with the existing government. And this, of course, the existing government is pursuing the lockdown. So it's a deliberate coming together of the one-party state. The coming together, where if you like, the woke brigade in both the Conservative and the Labor parties work together in cahoots, and anyone who happens to be not woke is destroyed. Anyone who happens to have traditional, if you like, traditional views on Labor, on conservatism, on free enterprise, things like that, on God, Queen and family, anyone who holds these views, they are thrown out. They are emasculated, they are white-handed, they are destroyed. And that's what the media is actually doing. This is a consolidation of the, if you like, coming together of the political parties to destroy freedom in Australia. It really, really is a very critical time. We're in a state of flux, a state of crisis, and we've got to have some clear thinking. And it comes down to the individuals within the parties. If they actually wake up to this situation, they should immediately resign from the party and run as an independent. That's what they should do, so that the electorate has got a clear alternative voice. And that, of course, as an independent, is an opportunity to find expression in our political mechanism. We really, really need to consider this. This is a state of crisis. Australia is, and no doubt it's the same in every free nation in the world. That's my view, and that's how I see it. And I think that this what we're looking at with these articles is we've got to disseminate the news. We've got to decipher it. We've got to look at the strategy. And it's always the same in a state of crisis when if you like, the Marxists attempt to seize control. And in this case, you say, well, obviously the Marxists, they must belong to the Green Party or to the Labor Party. Absolutely not. The Marxists, those who would be loyal to internationalism over and above their own people, are in all the parties. They're in all the parties, and you can't actually trust the party machine. You've got to really, really consider this deeply and considered. And to me, it's vitally important, even to the point of a news item we had in this past couple of weeks. A chief executive officer of the Australia Post was actually working vigorously to maintain viability of Australia Post. It had traditionally been run down by previous chief executive officers and by, I would dare say it, in my view, the board of directors of the Australian Post, which I understand are mostly Conservative appointees. Try that one. And the Australian Post was actually being run down to the point where it was just this haggard machine that was almost worthless. And this chief executive officer went in there and she turned it around, and she made it a viable company. She made it a viable alternative that was actually showing a profit, making a profit. And of course, this is against the agenda. This is against this idea of centralisation. This is against the idea of grasping all the assets of each nation and holding control of them in the hands of international finance. She was doing the very opposite of that. So of course, what happened? The Conservative government white-handed her in the Parliament. The Prime Minister himself white-handed her over something of absolutely no consequence, forcing her resignation because this pursuit of internationalism, this idea of Fabianism, of administrating the nation, of administrating the whole world, it's not new. And our Prime Minister is in the middle of it. In the middle of it. Don't think he's not. And I hear it, some people who say, oh, espousing all the virtues of him. I think he's in the middle of it. He is nothing like anything of the answer. He's worse than that. He is a serious part of the problem. So that's my view. I think it's there. I've laid it on the table. I do every week. I go hard because to me these issues are fundamental. Our freedoms are on the line here, ladies and gentlemen. Our freedoms are on the line. We've got to actually take stock of what's going on and draw out those politicians who do have a soul and who do actually want to do the right thing by the community. Draw them out, encourage them to resign from the party, encourage them to run as independents so that the electorate can have a viable alternative to the duopoly, which is really the one-party state. Thank you so much.
Well, I can confirm, Arnie,
Yeah.
that what you've said is a perfect description of what's going on in politics in Canada.
Yeah.
If you resist the political correctness agenda, you are toast. And not only will the party kick you out, but the media will excoriate you and destroy your reputation.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
You cannot have conservative views and exist in politics anymore.
Yeah. See, this is the destruction of our language. This is the destruction of our language. If we don't go along that black is white, that black is white, black is the new white, you know, this is the new language. Peace is war, you know, and this is now the new family. No, it's not. That's not a family. That is not the ideal environment that God ordained for bringing up children. That is not a family. That is something else. And we've got to consider, this is why cognitive dissonance is such a valid tool against us, because we can't actually recognize it. It's a confusion of terms. It's where we say something is this, when in actual fact you see with your eyes and you say, no, it's not. It's exactly the opposite of that. A good illustration is the Chinese using the term social credit for their state surveillance. So society's credit. It's got nothing to do with society. It's got to do with totalitarian control and a system of rewards and punishment, which of course has its roots in Pharisaism, legalism, and all this sort of stuff. Go back to, as Eric said in the video, go back to Plato, go back to the Illuminati, the French Revolution, go back to Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto. Go back to the Fabian Society, the London School of Economics. These are the roots of this same idea of totalitarianism. There it is. It's always been there. It's always bubbling away, but now it's got to the point where it's attempting to control the whole world. And if Mark is correct in saying that these agreements, these new treaties between nations are essentially establishing a world government, that's what this is about. The special drawing rights is the World Bank, the World Central Bank, and these new agreements or treaties between nations across the whole world is to bring about a world government, similar to that they did with Europe, with the European Union, deceptively so. And of course the European Union, the Parliament, has absolutely no say. The Parliament votes on nothing. The Parliament just sits there as a gabfest. The actual bureaucracy controls Europe. And they issue edicts. And that's what we're looking at. This is about world government on a world scale. We see the model in the Soviet Union. We see it in China. We see it in Europe. The point where there is no representation. Our freedoms are toast if we don't do something about this. Thank you so much, Robert. It's been a colourful, technically difficult, but a colourful forum. And give my best regards to your brother. And I hope he gets over his weariness. He's been bounced around for the last 48 hours, and so he hasn't rested well. And it is very important that in these difficult times we do concentrate on our health. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Cheers.
Thanks, Arnie.